Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite an interesting stack of source material in front of us today.
We do. It's mostly built around a video commentary from a Brazilian presenter, plus some related articles, transcriptions.
Right, and this material is really our lens for this deep dive.
Exactly. Our job here is to unpack these sources, pull out what they see as the key insights,
And really understand what this specific material highlights as significant about recent events down in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. And we'll be looking at a few different areas the source material really focuses on.
We'll kick off with something that, well, might seem a bit small at first glance, but the source frames it as quite telling about language.
Language and public figures, yeah. Then we shift to something much heavier, a diplomatic and legal issue.
That communication from the US Department of Justice to a Brazilian Supreme Court justice.
That's the one. Very pointed. And finally, we'll look at how, again, according to our source, some media outlets covered that letter.
Which the source claims kind of reveals some maybe deeper issues.
Definitely. So yeah, get ready. The source material has some, let's say, strong observations and a very clear viewpoint.
Okay, let's dive right in then.
Great.
So the source material kicks off with an incident that clearly caught its attention. It involves Brazil's First Lady, Janja.
Right, during a public announcement about the ENEM exam.
The ENEM, that's the big national high school exam in Brazil, right?
Yeah.
A huge deal for students.
Massive. And the source zeroes in on this one phrase she used. Tá no ar as inscrições pro ENEM.
Tá no ar as inscrições pro ENEM. Okay, so the source actually spends some time breaking this down, even brings in commentary from a Portuguese teacher.
It does. They highlight why this specific phrasing got their attention.
So what's the issue they point out? Why analyze the specific detail?
Well, according to the source's breakdown, there are a couple of grammatical points they see as problems.
Okay.
First, the verb tá. It's a contraction of está, which is singular.
Right.
But the subject, as inscrição in the registrations, that's plural.
I see. So grammatically, it should be the plural form. Estão no ar. Basic subject-verb agreement.
Exactly. That's the first point the source makes.
Makes sense. What else did they flag?
They also highlight pro. Now, this is presented as an informal and technically incorrect contraction of para-o.
Okay. So like saying gonna instead of going to, in English maybe, something you hear but isn't strictly correct.
Sort of, yeah. And while it's common in everyday speech, the source, leaning on the teacher's comments, argues that for someone in her position, a high-profile public role,
Right.
it's viewed as a significant slip-up in formal language.
The source actually quotes the teacher pretty directly on this, doesn't it? Saying this kind of casual talk doesn't really connect with young people.
Yeah, and that they should avoid, I think the phrase was, butchering the language.
Wow. And the source notes a similar error from the minister who was there too. Something about gratuita versus gratuito.
Yes, another agreement issue they pointed out. It shows the source is really focusing on this aspect of linguistic precision.
And how does the source interpret all this? It seems like more than just pointing out grammar mistakes.
Oh, definitely. The presenter in the source material views it as, well, a symptom of declining language standards.
Okay.
They even suggest, quite dramatically actually, that maybe officials are trying to act illiterate, their word.
Illiterate. Why would they do that?
The source suggests it might be a misguided attempt to connect with what they perceive as illiterate youth.
That's a pretty strong take. The source calls that idea madness, right?
Yes. It feels like the source sees this grammatical looseness from public figures as reflecting or maybe even causing a broader erosion of language standards.
And the presenter even catches himself making errors sometimes.
Admits it, yeah. Says poor grammar has become so common it's almost contagious.
It certainly makes you, pause and think, as the source clearly wants us to. Why does linguistic precision, especially from public figures, become such a flashpoint?
Yeah. Is it about setting a standard? Or the impact on education, public discourse? This source definitely frames it as something significant, not just a minor slip.
Okay, let's make a hard shift now. We're moving from the nuance of grammar to the pretty serious world of international law and diplomacy.
Right. A big gear shift. The course material spends a lot of time on this letter from the US Department of Justice.
Sent to Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes.
Exactly. Dated May 7th. This is clearly a central piece for the source. They mention that CNN Brazil reportedly got the full text.
And it didn't go straight to Moraes.
No, the source says it went via the Brazilian Ministry of Justice first, then to the Justice's office.
Okay, so what's the core message? As translated and presented by the source, quoting CNN Brazil, What did the US DOJ actually say? It sounds quite specific about jurisdiction.
Extremely specific. The source really highlights these key parts. First, the US DOJ says, look, we take no position on orders demanding action inside Brazil. That's your law, Brazilian law.
Okay, standard enough.
But, and this is the absolute key point, the source hammers home. The letter states very clearly that any directives ordering action in the United States are not considered enforceable judicial orders in the United States. Full stop.
Wow, okay. That's a very direct statement as the source presents it. What did the letter say was needed to make them enforceable in the U.S.?
According to the source's account of the letter, for any Brazilian order to actually have legal force in the U.S., it needs to go through the proper U.S. legal procedures, recognition, execution. Basically, the U.S. court system has to validate it.
So you can't just, email an order from Brazil and expect a U.S. company to legally have to obey it.
That's exactly the implication the source draws. You need to follow the established international legal protocols.
And the source gives context for why this letter even came about, right? It connects to Justice Moraes' actions.
Yes, it mentions Moraes had been issuing orders involving Rumble, which is an American company.
Okay.
And also the journalist Allan dos Santos. He's Brazilian but lives in the U.S.
And the source indicates Moraes tried to order Rumble in the U.S. to do things, like take down content related to Allan dos Santos and provide data.
That's what the source states. That Moraes was attempting to exert his authority directly onto U.S. soil, targeting a U.S. company regarding a person residing in the U.S.
And this is where the source presenter really offers a strong interpretation of what that DOJ letter means.
Oh, absolutely. They see it as the U.S. basically saying, hold on a minute.
Like, you've overstepped.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The source's take is that the U.S. was telling Moraes he doesn't grasp the limits of his jurisdiction internationally.
So the source interprets it as the U.S. saying, you can't just boss around American companies or dictate actions on our territory. You don't have that direct power here.
That's precisely the framing. That Moraes lacks direct standing or power in the U.S. for these kinds of orders. He needs to play by the international rules of the game, use the proper channels.
It definitely underscores, as the source points out, just how complex enforcing national laws across borders really is.
Absolutely. A really key point about sovereignty and legal systems.
So following on from that really interesting clarification from the US DOJ, let's dig into the next big piece of the source material.
Right, which is how this letter was covered, or allegedly miscovered, by parts of the Brazilian media. Specifically, CNN Brazil comes under scrutiny.
Okay, so the source commentary looks at CNN's reporting and finds differing perspective.
Yeah, different. And the source argues even contradictory takes within CNN's own coverage of this letter. It contrasts two figures.
Okay, who's first?
First, they mention CNN analyst Lorival Santana. The source describes his view as calling the letter a reprimand.
A reprimand? That sounds serious.
He apparently said he'd never seen this kind of thing between friendly democracies, suggesting is how the U.S. might treat dictatorships. He saw it as diplomatically weighty, even though the letter used polite language, like respectfully.
Okay, so that's one take. Serious diplomatic reprimand. Who does the source contrast him with?
With another CNN presenter, Deborah Oliveira. And this is where the source's critique becomes really, really pointed.
How so? What did she say, according to the source?
According to the source, she framed the letter differently. She apparently stated it simply alerts that Brazilian orders aren't automatically enforceable in the U.S. unless they go through the U.S. recognition process.
Which sounds factually accurate on its own, maybe. But the source says she misrepresented the central target.
Exactly. The source makes a direct accusation here. They claim she shifted the focus.
Shifted it how?
They argue she framed the letter as being mainly about Rumble's situation in Brazil. Like saying Rumble was suspended in Brazil because it didn't follow Brazilian orders.
Orders like
removing Allan dos Santos' profile, blocking funds, appointing a legal representative in Brazil, things happening within Brazil.
Ah, I see the source's point now. They're saying she took the focus off Moraes trying to enforce orders in the U.S.
Yes.
And made it seem like the letter was just about Rumble's compliance issues inside Brazil.
Precisely. The source presenter gets quite worked up about this, arguing she completely twisted the core issue. The source insists the letter's main point was about Moraes' attempts to exert power on U.S. soil, not Rumble's status in Brazil.
And the source takes issue with something else she mentioned, about legal representatives.
Yeah, the source strongly challenges her claim that companies operating in Brazil must have a legal representative there. The source calls this a made-up rule.
Made up by whom?
invented by Moraes, in the source's view, specifically to go after companies he doesn't like. The source is adamant this is an actual Brazilian law.
And the source uses some really strong language for her reporting here, right?
Oh, yeah, pure fake news. That's the direct quote the source uses.
Wow. That's blunt.
It is. And this specific critique then feeds into the source's much broader commentary on the Brazilian press in general.
Okay, what's the wider accusation?
Sweeping claims, really. That the press constantly twists information is inherently fake news, has manipulated the Brazilian public for years, even influenced elections, the source claims.
And connects this to the internet.
Yes, arguing the press wants to censor the internet now because, in the source's view, people can go online and find the truth themselves instead of just getting the press's alleged lies.
So this section, as the source presents it, is a real case study in media criticism.
Definitely. It highlights, from their perspective, the challenge of navigating different interpretations of the same event. It's a very specific and obviously highly critical take on how information can be framed, or, as the source claims, deliberately misrepresented.
It certainly leaves you with a lot to think about regarding media literacy and how stories get told.
No doubt.
So that was quite a journey through this particular source material. We started with a close look at language standards in high office, or at least the source's critical view on them.
Right, from grammar to geopolitics, basically.
Yeah.
Then we dove into the specifics of that U.S. Department of Justice letter, really clarifying international legal boundaries, again, as interpreted by the source.
And finally, we examined the source's really sharp analysis of how some media outlets apparently covered those events, leading to accusations of, well, manipulation.
Yeah, it connects dots between communication styles, the limits of national power, and the whole complex world of media interpretation, all viewed through this one specific and quite pointed source lens.
So, thinking about all these pieces together, the source's points on language precision, the very specific details about judicial limits from the US DOJ, and then that strong accusation from the source about media framing, it does raise a final thought for you, the listener. Considering just what this source material presented, what might this combination of elements suggest about the way information flows, how power is exercised, and how it's all perceived or perhaps shaped in public view, according to the source's perspective, of course?
It's definitely a lot to chew on, what this particular source wants you to see about the interplay of words, law, and media.